Our next guest I want to introduce first in English and then in Dutch. Ramzy Baroud is a political scientist and a historian, a Palestinian political scientist and historian, of course. Living now in Seattle and in London, but he was born and raised in Gaza. He has written 3 books. The last is called My Father is a Freedom Fighter, which is autobiographical, I might say, and he has also published in numerous publications, from The Guardian to The Washington Post to the Japan Times to the Straits Times of Singapore, you name it, and also in almost every English language publication in the Middle East. And he told me that he aims at contributing to a writing of the Palestinian history which is integral, so beyond the borders of geography, ideology, or even sentimentality. Is that correct? Yes. Now in Dutch. Ik wil jullie graag voorstellen aan Ramzy Baroud. Ramzy Baroud is een politieke wetenschapper en historicus die tegenwoordig in de Verenigde Staten en in Engeland woont, waar hij geboren en getogen is in Gaza. Hij heeft 3 boeken geschreven, waarvan het laatste is My Father is a Freedom Fighter, autobiografisch. Hij heeft in tal van kranten en tijdschriften gepubliceerd, van de Washington Post tot The Guardian tot de Japan Times, de Straits Times, dat je net al genoemd. En bijna elke Engelstalige publicatie in het Midden-Oosten. En hij heeft me verteld dat hij wil bijdragen aan de Palestijnse geschiedschrijving die integraal is, dus niet gecompartimenteerd, dus voorbij de grenzen van de geografie, de ideologie en van het sentiment. Now please, it's a pleasure to invite you to the floor.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, but also for that interview you conducted with Jivara. I thought it was very, really very humanizing and also very telling in the sense, in the sense that we don't get that version of the story. Oftentimes we kind of get this kind of media filtered version of a Palestinian story. This is something that's very real and it's happening to hundreds of thousands of people in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and elsewhere. And in essence, I do believe that this is really the story of the Nakba. I mean, what Jivara was describing was ultimately what our grandparents and our parents were describing at one point in 1947 and 1948. It's a story of this physical displacement, but along with that physical displacement, you had many forms of displacement and dispossession, cultural, political. The very physical landscape of Palestine had changed in 1947-48, and it never ceased from changing. It is the reality that we are still having to deal with today. I must admit that I did not know that today was the 70-year anniversary of the defeat of the Nazis. I just didn't. I think I was just very consumed with all sorts of tragedies that are underway in the Middle East, and until I turned on the BBC this morning, I was watching the news and the celebrations in Russia and elsewhere, and I know recently that was commemorated in the Netherlands as well. We know that what the Dutch people had to go through under the Nazi occupation for 5 years. And I'm not really here to make comparisons per se, as much as just to really think about that number, 70, 7 decades. Our people have been uprooted from their lands 67 years ago. That's nearly 7 decades. You gained your freedom and your ability to function as a society, as a nation, to define yourself free from the reins of the occupation and the brutality of the occupier, and around that very time, more or less, kind of fell victim to that very mentality and that very regime. and we are still struggling with it ever since. This is really important. I think in a way, it creates a sense of unity between all of us as human beings. I am not coming to you with a message from Mars. It's something that you can very much relate to. The same way that a South Korean can relate to what happened during the Japanese occupation, and a South African can relate to what happened during the apartheid regime, and so forth and so on. Ultimately, we are unified by common causes. No matter how different you may think that we are, in actuality, we're not. We are very much similar and very much the same, and I think in many ways this is why you are here today. You are here today because you can relate, perhaps at a subconscious level. I mean, yes, it's for you, it's about solidarity. And I'm really impressed by the level of solidarity that I have seen here. But it's also about something else, because ultimately, for you, you do not want what has befallen your people, your ancestors, your grandparents and your parents, to befall someone else. It's ultimately about that. And that's what unifies us, and should continue to unify us. I was asking one of the gentlemen here, we were talking about the Netherlands Palestine Committee. I think I was showing to you, Robert, earlier, and I wrote down, started 1996, and I thought, that's impressive, that's commitment. It's been going on for that long, and then I was told, no, it's 1969. I got the numbers mixed up. That's commitment. And that's what keeps you going, despite of all the despair in the Yarmouk refugee camp that you see on the screen. All the despair that you read about, the pain and the suffering and the struggle, there is that momentum that keeps you going and keeps us going and keeps creating that narrative of resistance and solidarity that continues after all these generations. The Nakba is not a question of history, it's not a question of memory, it's a living memory, it's a living process. We are living that. In Syria, we lived it in Iraq during the American invasion, 2003. We lived it in Kuwait in 1990-91. We lived it just more recently in Libya. We are living it in Gaza. We are living it in Balie. We are living it in Ain al-Hilwa, in Burj al-Barajni. We are living it everywhere. Even the Palestinians who stayed in what is today Israel, they are also living it because of the struggle of the daily reality that they have to undergo on a daily basis, being second or third class citizens of that country. And that's what also unifies us as Palestinians. I mean, think about it. You have numerous physical fragmentations. I don't think any nation in the world has ever underwent, and not to be accused of exaggerating, just look at the 20th century alone. I don't think there's any nation that has been fragmented in terms of its national identity as much as the Palestinian people. 67 years, but even prior to that, in the 20s, in the 30s, the rebellion of the Palestinian peasants from 1936 until 1939, to think of the political consciousness of Palestinians in the 30s, when people were still trying to figure out what does it even mean to have a national identity, to have a nation of extremely poor people, peasants, workers, who were kicked out of their factories in Haifa and Jaffa. When the Zionist Histadrut was established, they found themselves jobless, unified with the peasants, and for 3 years led a rebellion against one of the most colonial and aggressive regimes that have ever existed. And they survived, and they prevailed. And 1947, 1948, the ethnic cleansing, the uprooting of an entire nation, basically within the matter of months, that has been basically taken out of every physical space that they could relate to and sent out to a completely different physical space that they could not relate to, and yet for 67 years. For 67 years, they are still holding the keys, the deeds to the land, the names of the villages, the memories, the living memories. We are still living the Nakba. As if Israel doesn't want us to actually forget about the Nakba. They are constantly reminding us of the Nakba. I know what you meant, Jivara, when you said a piece of paradise. It's that idea. I was talking to an American, British rather, historian who spent a lot of time working with refugees from Cyprus and other parts of the world. And when he went to Ain al-Hilwa, he came back and he said, I think everything I thought I knew about refugees is wrong. When he met the people of Ain al-Hilwa, he said that they can describe their villages back in Palestine as if they've been there. Little children, they know exactly where they come from. They can describe the harvest season, the celebrations, the everything of Palestine after all of these years. It's not that we refuse to assimilate. I actually think that we assimilate pretty well when we are given that opportunity. It's about something that is much more profound. It's about identity as a nation. It's also about the question of justice. You see, you move on with your life when you achieve a level of closure. Yeah? So things move on eventually. But that closure is never there. Every few months, Israel reminds us somehow that that closure is not there. Gaza alone. We talk about the siege in Gaza in 2006 and Hamas and Fatah and all of that. In reality, the siege in Gaza started in 1948. Gaza has always been under one form of siege or another. In 1948, as soon as Israel was established in the ruins of 518 Palestinian villages in what later became Israel, they have established what they call the death zone between Gaza and Israel. So you had these refugees basically trying, it's like they could not comprehend the idea that this is no longer my land. They could not comprehend the idea that I can no longer go and harvest my oranges or my olives, or the concept just did not click in right away. And then they would go through the death zone to collect oranges and figs and try to visit their land back in Palestine. In fact, there's a story that I mentioned in my last book about an argument that started between my grandparents, where my grandfather did not want to bring the new blankets with him on the back of a donkey as they were driven out of Palestine, because they are going to get all dusty and they are going to get ruined in the journey. And while my grandmother insisted that you never know, let's just bring them, and when we go back to Palestine in a couple of weeks, we can take the blankets with us. Of course, they never did. They lived in a refugee camp in Gaza, and that's where I was born until they died. But the argument over the blankets just really kind of gets you thinking about the level of hope that people had, that they thought the world cannot possibly watch and allow this to happen. You just can't possibly drive entire towns from Ramle to Haifa to Yafa to Lidde to small villages like Zarnuqa and Beit Daras and Batani and so forth. Nearly 1 million people, just drive them out, destroy their homes, or the ones that are presentable enough, you just take over it and call it your own, and then everything is going to be okay. Well, it's not. And it won't. As long as the question of injustice continues to define this conflict, as long as the Palestinians will not cease and persist on demanding their rights, as long as The Israelis continue to treat Palestinians as second-class citizens, completely ignore that there is a question called the refugee question, and deal with Gaza as if it's an experiment for their new weapons. And they think that they have complete control over the media narrative. They have their very smart, just spokespeople with the various accents that appeals to the various target audiences, and they just sit there and they have the same talking points translated to every possible language, and they keep feeding the same lies over and over and over again. And they think it's going to all go away. It won't. It won't, simply because you have 5 million Palestinian refugees. And those refugees, one generation after the other, has been educated that this is my land. And that's where I belong. Whether I'm an American citizen, whether you are a Dutch citizen, ultimately, that's our land. It's not a question of citizenship. It's not a question of paper. It's not a question of property. It is something much more profound, and something that Israel cannot possibly comprehend. Even if they wish to understand, they won't be able to. So the Nakba is part of our identity. And it's not about crying on the ruins of what we have lost. It's about us as people. We are the product of the Nakba. And everything that we are experiencing in our lives, somehow, if you draw a line between every single Palestinian anywhere in the world, somehow you will find it ultimately connects to that word, the Nakba. Even if we differ, even if we bicker, even if we fight, the rich and the poor, those who stayed and those who left, those in refugee camps and those in urban centers, ultimately it's about that single event that defined us as a nation. And neither perhaps the old died, but the young never forgot. We've never forgotten because we've taught our kids. You know, the first thing I did when Google Earth, I was actually sharing that with friends. I said when Google Earth was first started, the first thing I did, I went back to find where my village back in Palestine was. So I was telling a group of friends that this is the case, and they tell me, that's strange, that's exactly what everybody did. So ultimately, when Google Earth started for Palestinian refugees, it was just an opportunity to see exactly where your village was back in Palestine. Before my refugee camp, I checked on my village before I checked on my refugee camp back in Palestine. But of course, you have the question of the active memory. What happened in Gaza is very much related to what happened in 1947-48. And the resistance that you see in Gaza right now, and I emphasize the resistance because it's really, really important that at least we honor the Palestinian people by accepting the fact that, number one, they have the right to defend themselves. Number two, that they are not docile, passive creatures. They are very, very strong people. In 1948, within months of the Nakba, you had a group of fighters called Fidaiyin. These are the peasants who were driven out of Palestine, forming groups, Fidaiyin, freedom fighters. Ultimately, their aim was to get back, to check on their homes, and then they start going in and they would fight with the Israelis. Many of them never came back, of course. And in the refugee camps, then they would have these symbolic coffins carried around in the refugee camp to commemorate yet another martyr who went to Palestine and never came back. And the Fidaiyin was not a factional group. It was not affiliated with any government. It was not a sectarian group. These are peasants, fighters, strong men and women who managed to start that spark of the resistance that you see in Gaza right now. Recently, the second man of Hamas was died. He had stomach cancer, I believe, and died. And I was reporting on the story for Middle East Eye, which the publication where these photos come from. And I discovered that he was actually my geography teacher. And And I'm thinking, my gosh, of course, he was involved with Hamas, Sheikh Hamad al-Hassanat. Now, Hamad al-Hassanat was the nicest man. He's a refugee. He was in his 80s when he passed away. When Hamas started in Gaza, during the first Intifada in 1987, again, there was that kind of drive during the Intifada to articulate a discourse of resistance somehow. Refugees, the descendants of peasants, got together, formulated groups, and they fought. And they fought, and now, when Hamad al-Hassanat was buried, I was looking at the pictures and I could not believe thousands of fighters from all Palestinian factions taking him to be buried. And I'm thinking to myself, when he started that group with few other UN teachers in Gaza, there were literally four fighters. And I remember that because one of them was a classmate of mine in the refugee camp. And I also remember because it was the first time that we saw Palestinian fighters actually wearing a uniform, like a military uniform in Gaza. It was particularly interesting because we thought, wow, dressed up like the Israelis, like, you know, the khaki clothes and the kufiya. And then when they used to come with their Kalashnikovs in the camp, everybody would rush to meet them, and it's like, this is something really incredible. And there were four. And all four of them were killed within weeks. And when Gaza was under the recent Israeli war protective edge, the four somehow multiplied to be thousands and thousands. Now that doesn't mean by any means that Palestinian resistance is at par with Israeli brutality. But it's also important to acknowledge the fact that Palestinians just do not sit there and expect things to happen. They stand and they fight. And that's why we are here, because 67 years later, we are still speaking of the Nakba. If it were not for one generation after another, upholding and holding on that promise, that original promise, that we will fight back and we will get back to our country one day. And when I say resistance, I'm not talking about Kalashnikovs. I'm talking about the spirit of the people. I'm talking about the collective resistance. I'm talking about the will not to be defeated. And that is something that we all have in common. No matter how much we disagree with one another, we ultimately have that in common. And that's what keeps us strong. That's what keeps you talking about us and us talking about you. Otherwise, this issue would have vanished. As far as Israel was concerned, they just wanted this whole issue to be kind of folded a long time ago. And for those peasants and the descendants of the peasants to somehow melt into the population of the Middle East. They're all Arabs anyway. So who cares what's a Palestinian, what's a Syrian? You know, the Arabs will find a way to accommodate and incorporate them into their midst, and the whole issue is sorted out. But it's not. I was in Chile about a year and a half ago. And I was just astounded by you have this Palestinian community of nearly 400,000 Palestinians. Many of them actually come from before the Nakba, which is really quite interesting because since they did not experience the Nakba directly, since their forefathers did not experience the Nakba directly, and they were called the Turks. Palestinians in Chile and Brazil, they used to call them the Ottomans, the Turks, because they came before all of this. Yet it was absolutely astounding to see the level of prowess and pride they have in being Palestinians. The team Palestinos, the second most popular football team in Chile. And then a few months ago, they've decided that they want to put a full Palestinian, a map of historic Palestine on their shirt. And the FIFA said, you don't take it out, you will be kicked out of FIFA. You cannot participate in the national team of Chile. And the fight that these guys just put to keep the map of Palestine on their shirt. Chile, all the way, where Patagonia, where Argentina, it's in the other corner of the earth, yet somehow these Palestinians are still fighting with the same spirit and the same prowess of every Palestinian community you find everywhere. there is something good in that. I know. The situation is horrible. I know. If you look at it, it's really, really difficult for Palestinians these days. I was asked, as the Arab Spring started, Ramzy, is this good for Palestine or not? And immediately my answer was, well, yeah, I mean, you have to look at so many different variables to reach that conclusion. We don't know. I mean, it's good that the Arab people are rising. That's a good thing. But we don't know. You know, you have the traditional powers and the rulers and the old imperialists and the neo-imperialists and so many different groupings that are going to try to ensure that the outcome does not serve the people of that region. We know that. But the fact that there is this kind of political consciousness, if indeed democracy prevails in some of these countries, that is definitely good for the Palestinians. But then as things began getting from bad to worse, you start revisiting that statement, thinking, were we too rash to actually have expected that this could be good for Palestine and for the rest of the Arab people? Until a few days ago, and this is my article for Middle East Eye for this week, until I was sitting and talking to a colleague of mine from Egypt. And he tells me, he goes, as an Egyptian refugee, he goes, and he carried on. And it kind of like clicked, as an Egyptian refugee. I mean, you know about refugees from Syria, from Lebanon, from Iraq, from Egypt, from Bahrain, from Yemen, from everywhere. But to have it articulated as part of a larger context with such ease, it's kind of like, my goodness, I mean, we've been that as a Palestinian refugee for the past 67 years. And to see an Egyptian say that, it was a little bit kind of puzzling. I mean, we were hoping that the Egyptians are going to be the ones who are going to come to our rescue. And now the Egyptian is telling me as an Egyptian refugee. So I went back and started doing some digging to discover that every single day in the Arab world, you have 10,000 new refugees. Every single day. And I am still trying to spin something positive out of it. And you know what I came up with? Sometimes, in a desperate situation, you've got to try to find a positive spin on things. Otherwise, it's just going to become so unbearable. But really, I kind of thought about it. For 67 years, Palestinians were isolated. They are refugees, the refugee problem. You talk to an Arab anywhere in the Middle East and they tell you, you know, out of sympathy, haram, masaki, poor Palestinians, you know. And I don't like it, I really don't, you know, because I think that we are very, very empowered people. We just don't give up. You know, no, don't pity me, thank you, but please don't. But it was just kind of, as if it was a form of therapy for Arabs to, you know, poor Palestinians, and you know, if there's a campaign on television or at the mosque to drop few dirhams, few dinars, few dollars for Palestinians and feel like you've done your share and then you move on, yeah? But now, you have 35 million refugees, new refugees, from Iraq to Syria, to Libya, to Yemen, to Lebanon, plus the Palestinians. It's an Arab Nakba. It's an Arab Nakba. It's not just a Palestinian Nakba. And here is, sorry to say, but here's a positive spin on it. We are in this together. We are in this together. You can't isolate. You can't divide problems anymore. You can't overlook problems anymore. We are in this together. We are on a small boat trying to cross to safety somewhere. And it's either we sink together, and that's not an option, or we make it to safety together. And we have to. And that's the power of the people. The Arab people are really much more powerful and resourceful than we may think. They are not victims. Palestinians are not victims. Victimization is a temporary process. It's something that happens and Yarmouk will be rebuilt. And those who were killed will be buried. And somehow we will find a way to incorporate and to interpret that into our larger narrative of tragedy. But somehow we are going to find a way to carry on and to move forward. we have so much that we need to do. There's so much that needs to be done. And we need to do this, not you. With all of the amazing solidarity we have been receiving in recent years from all over the world, the Netherlands included, there is some soul searching that we have to. We have to repair the big gaps in our fragmented identity. Fragmented by Israeli walls, checkpoints, by Israeli wars, by American blind support for Israel, Western hypocrisy on Israel, but also by us, by the mistakes and the sins that we have committed as Palestinians, by a leadership that basically sold out our rights. By that division that exists in our own society between the West Bank and Gaza. Ultimately, there is no West Bank and Gaza. It's the human, it's the Palestinian that exists. Whether you are in the West Bank, or Gaza, or Yarmouk, or Ain al-Hilwa, or in Nazareth, or in Galilee, you're ultimately a Palestinian as far as Israel is concerned. And we need to find a way to repair our fragmented national identity. So we have a lot of work to do. A work that is way above Hamas and Fatah, the Palestinian Authority and the PLO and all the politics and the politicking. It's about the individual, and we have got to get there. Because only when we get there, we can actually develop a national party. Only then. But in the meantime, your solidarity is essential. It's essential. I don't think that this can actually be done without international solidarity. Israel is a militarily powerful state. Israel has the backing, just in case its military power is not good enough. They have the backing of the world's greatest and largest military power, and the shameless support of that military power in many European countries. I know that things are changing. I know that we are getting to the point where critical mass is becoming so impressive that perhaps we are going to get our South Africa moment. And I really hope that this happens sooner than later. But we can't stop the momentum now. We can't. This is not about taking a stance on are you pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. This is not a football match. This is something far more important and far more critical. It's about a nation that continues to suffer and struggle for nearly 7 decades. And they have been left helpless and defenseless. Only their own devices, only their own resourcefulness, only their own creativity. And they have been, for many years, been left alone. And now we need to change that paradigm. We don't need tears, we need actual support and solidarity. And I think the first step towards that support and solidarity has to be looking inward. I was in South Africa recently, and a group of Muslim imams from across the country came to meet with me in Cape Town. And one of them asked me the question, Hamas, Fatah, you guys are fighting. I said, look at the South African experience. Now that apartheid has been defeated, we don't talk about the kind of fragmentation that happened within the South African resistance movements prior to the defeat of apartheid. We kind of we tend to brush things under the rug, as they say. But in reality, every liberation movement has its own conflicts. And that is something for us to sort out. But what I need you to sort out, I need you to ensure that the last military arms contracts between South Africa and Israel are cancelled. There's absolutely no need for you to be selling explosive bullets to Israel. Even if it's an $8 million contract, there's no point. Why? We stood in solidarity with you. It's your time. Leave our problems aside. Again, we will sort this out. But you need to ensure that that military contract is cancelled. Because these explosive bullets will find their ways to the body and the skulls of Palestinian children. So we will talk about Hamas and Fatah later. For now, think as a South African. What can I do at home first? Boycott BDS. We need to boycott Israel. Not as an act of punishment. Not as an act of punishment per se. We need to boycott Israel because Israel needs to understand that there is accountability. You can't possibly Carry on doing what you are doing for all of these years and think that at the end of the day, we just sit together and debate and talk about things and, and all of us talk about why peace is so important and fundamental and that's it. We can't. There has got to be accountability. The Israelis have got to understand this. And now you hear this coming more and more from Israelis themselves. That their society is almost completely detached from the reality that they have imposed on the Palestinians. And that has been going on for many years. And that has got to stop. There has got to be accountability. We're not asking anybody to go to war against Israel. We are going to withstand this. We are strong, we are resourceful, we are tough. But your responsibility as a Dutch citizen, as a French citizen, as a German citizen, as an American, as a Korean, as a South African, what is it that you are doing or not doing to contribute to the Israeli occupation? That has got to be dealt with, and urgently so. That's your responsibility. That's the homework that you need to do. And again, we have a lot of homework that we need to do as Palestinians. I wanted to touch on a couple of other things. Recently, I wrote an article called Stuck in Area A. As you know, the West Bank, after Oslo, was divided to 3 sections. Area A, under Palestinian Authority control. Area B, under joint security control between Israel and the Palestinians. And Area C, which is basically 65% of the entirety of the West Bank, under Israeli control. Oslo has done something terrible to us. I'm not going to even talk about the political wisdom or lack of wisdom of Oslo, which really should have been obvious to many people very early on. But what Oslo has done, it has fragmented the Palestinian geography. We can't stop thinking about Area A because Mahmoud Abbas is in Ramallah and Ramallah is in Area A. And anything that happens outside the confines of that area becomes kind of quite irrelevant. So when the Palestinians were driven out of Iraq in 2003, lots of people were scratching their head. Palestinian refugees in Iraq, Baladiyat, neighborhood, what is going on? Lots of people couldn't even understand, the Palestinian refugee experience in Iraq. And when the same thing happened in Syria, as Jivara said, the Palestinian refugees in Syria were treated actually pretty well. And yet, there is a compromise. See, it's not like, well, since they were treated well, and lots of people are using that argument, therefore Assad is good. Why are you having a problem? No. It doesn't work that way. You should be treated with respect and take that for granted as a human being, as a citizen in any society. You're not doing me a favor. By treating me with respect, I don't need to spend the rest of my life just acknowledging and kissing feet and hands. The fact is that we were not treated as bad as Jordan or as bad in Lebanon. It doesn't mean that Assad is a really No, we were treated with respect because the Palestine narrative is so essential to every Arab regime. They use that. Every Arab ruler is somehow the liberator of Palestine. Everyone, you hear their speeches, it's absolutely impressive. The battles that they have won for Palestine, the things that they have done for Palestine. And you look at the reality and you see Palestinians in these very own communities, it's treated so very poorly. Okay, leave Jerusalem and Ramallah and Liddi and Ramle. We can talk about this later. Don't you think you should be treating Palestinians in your own society with a little bit of dignity? But in most of these societies, they are actually not. So, because Palestinians in Syria were integrated a bit better than the rest, there was that argument, well, they were treated pretty well, but they were ungrateful. We were not ungrateful, we just did not want to be pushed into a conflict that's not ours. Our conflict is with a Zionist entity called Israel. That's our conflict. Our frames of references, our history, our reality, our fight, our war is with that. We don't want to be shoved into anybody's conflict, and we don't want to be given ultimatums either. You are either with us, as Bush has said, and Jivara has repeated, not knowing it's related to Bush. It's either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists. That's not an ultimatum to give a refugee population that has no formal IDs for crying out loud. They are running in circles, as they run in Syria and Iraq, in Kuwait, in Libya. They are running in circles because they have no documents, because their travel documents is undefined. They can't enter the vast majority of the world. And now even Egypt, the only country that used to allow Palestinians to enter based on that travel document, does not do that anymore. They get deported. If you're a Palestinian professor, Palestinian whatever, it doesn't matter. You go to the Cairo International Airport, you sit in a holding area, a police officer comes, they put you in a police car, and they take you all the way to Rafah. You are not even allowed to stay in Egypt. Yet, the moment that the Palestinians failed to live up to whatever political price that was supposed to be exacted from them, massacred. That's the only option. So we need to redefine our relationship. When we say Palestine, we're not saying Oslo. When we say Palestine, we're not saying Mahmoud Abbas. We're not saying Hamas either. When we say Palestine, we are talking about the Palestinian people everywhere. In Palestine, in Shatat, in diaspora, in refugee camps, and we are also talking about the Nakba. We're not talking about 1967, the war of 1960, as terrible as that war was, and the fact that 350,000 more Palestinians were made refugees as a result of that war. We are talking about the original sin. We are talking about that Nakba, and the Nakba that continues, or continued ever since. So we need to expand our understanding and redefine our relationship to Palestine and the Palestinian struggle. And the first step we do is by taking our own responsibility, by accepting our responsibility toward the Palestinian people. I'm going to leave you with that, and just to say thank you so much for being here, for the opportunity to speak to you, for the fantastic activists who have been doing this day in and day out. I really admire all of this work, Robert, and all of you. Thank you so much, and again, thanks for this.